In a previous lesson, we touched on what log color space is and how that plays into your overall color pipeline and order of operations. In this lesson, though, I do want to expand a little bit more on exactly what log means as far as your workflow and some different options for getting your footage out of this really flat log color space and into Rec 709, which is ultimately what you're going to be color grading in most of the time. So as you can see here, I have my same log shot. And as a refresher, for those of you who didn't watch the previous lesson, log footage always typically looks like what you're looking at now. It's very flat and sort of murky and muddy. There's really lifted shadows and highlights that are brought down significantly, and that's all done in camera as a means to capture as much dynamic range as possible. But of course, in the color grade, you don't want your footage to necessarily look like this. You want to be able to add contrast, saturation, and other color adjustments to make it look more presentable even before you apply any sort of creative color grade to your footage. The good news is getting your footage out of log is really quite simple, and there are basically 3 or 4 different ways that you can do so, and I'm going to walk you through exactly how we can do that here in Davinci Resolve, and keep in mind you can apply these principles in any software. The first version involves using a color correction LUT to convert the values on the shot level. So right now in Davinci Resolve, we're just working with this one individual shot that you can see right here in the viewer. And if we wanted to add a LUT to this shot, we can simply right click here on this node, which is our first color correction node for this shot, scroll down to LUTs, then we're going to go to 3D LUT. And this was shot on an Alexa, so we're going to select the Alexa Log C to Rec 709 profile right here. And as soon as I select that, immediately the shot is brought into Rec 709 color space. So I'll toggle that on and off. And that's already bringing us to a really good starting point where we can now create a base grade and then a creative look on top of that. It's also worth noting that Davinci Resolve, along with a lot of other editing and color software, will come with LUTs installed specifically for translation. So if we look back in the LUT menu here, we not only have the Alexa Log C to Rec 709 LUT, but also LUTs for Blackmagic cameras, Olympus, Panasonic, Red, and Sony. So you're able to either use the built-in LUTs here, or you can download custom LUTs if you want from the internet and integrate that into your pipeline. And we're going to touch on exactly how to do that in a different lesson. But for now, it's important just to recognize that the first primary method that you have for applying a LUT to your footage is doing so on the shot level. So what we did just here is only applying to this one shot, and you can certainly work that way through your whole timeline and just go shot by shot applying that LUT individually. But sometimes that's not the most efficient way to work. Let's say your entire timeline is filled with clips shot on the same camera in the same color space. You don't need to do this for every single shot. What you could do is just apply a global LUT to everything that you're working on. And the way to do that is, first and foremost, I'm going to reset this node here so we're back to scratch. And I'm going to click up here where it says clip, and I'm going to select timeline. And then I'll hit Option S to create a serial node. So right now, if I just toggle back and forth between these two, it's going to look like basically the same thing, clip and timeline. You're just seeing a single node. The difference is if we were to apply a color grade, or in this case, a LUT to this node on the timeline level, it will affect every single shot in the timeline that we're working with. So let's go ahead and do that and see what happens. So we're going to go back to our Alexa Log C to Rec 709 LUT, apply it. So on this shot, it looks perfect. But if you look at some of the other shots in our timeline now that actually weren't shot on Alexa, they're going to look really strange. Take a look at this one, for example. So that's obviously way too strong of an effect. This is what the shot was already looking like. In this case, the shot was actually pre-graded. But you could take a look at some other shots. For example, this one, if I toggle it off, wasn't really pre-graded, but it does have a little bit more contrast than the Alexa has. So if you apply that Alexa LUT to this shot, it's just going to be way too harsh, way too severe. The log to Rec 709 LUTs by nature add a tremendous amount of contrast to your image because, again, look what we're starting with. We're basically starting with the least amount of contrast possible. So with that in mind, the only time you would ever apply any sort of technical log to Rec. 709 LUT to your entire timeline would be if every single shot was taken on the same camera using the exact same settings. Otherwise, if you have one shot on a Red, one on an Alexa, one on a Canon, then you have to really address each of those shots independently. A third option that you have in Davinci Resolve for applying a LUT globally to your entire project, not just one timeline, is to go into your settings here. You just right click on the bottom, and then you're going to click over on color management. And as you can see here under Lookup Tables, we have the option to select a lookup table for all of these different settings. The one that we would want to use in this case is 3D output lookup table. So if you were to click here and then select Alexa log C to Rec. 709, we're going to click save. Now our entire timeline is going to have that LUT applied. So even if I disable this node, you can see I deleted the node. I'm going to delete the node again here on the clip level. So there's no color correction really being applied to this image on the timeline level, but we're still getting that Alexa log C to Rec. 709 LUT applied because we did it on the project level. But similar to applying this on a timeline level globally, you don't really want to do this unless not only every shot in your sequence or your timeline is shot on Alexa or is shot on the same camera, but every shot in your project. So you might have 4, 5, 6 different timelines. Maybe one of them is all Alexa footage, but maybe another one's all Red footage. So if you were to use our settings browser here, color management panel, and apply this here, it might work well in one timeline because that's where your Alexa footage is living, but it won't work well in the other timeline. So obviously you have these three different options. You have the shot level, you have the timeline level, and then you have the project level. And you can really pick and choose how you want to integrate that translation LUT into your workflow depending on how your project is configured. There's one other option that you have as well that I want to share with you. So let's reset this here and save. So we're sort of going back to our log look right from scratch here. I'll start by creating a serial node here. Again, that's just Option S in Resolve. And then we'll go over to our color wheels. And I'm actually going to add contrast here just by crushing the shadows, lifting up the highlights a little bit, and just playing around with the midtones, trying to find a good balance just to my eye where it looks like we've added enough contrast. And then I'm also noticing the color balance isn't quite right here. So at the same time, I can just start pulling and pushing around my midtones, my highlights, all the different variables here to create that base look. I could also use the contrast slider down here if I want to really add some contrast to it. I could adjust the saturation, which is usually what you'll have to do, especially when you're working with such flat footage like this from a log camera. So we're going to go full screen now just to show you this quick before and after. But here it is before and after. I'm just toggling it on and off. And obviously this isn't a final look, but I think it does illustrate the point that you don't necessarily need to use a LUT when you're working with log footage. I do recommend using a LUT because I just think it's going to speed up your color workflow immensely, especially when you're doing this sort of technical correction that you'd probably have to do over and over on every shot. But you don't necessarily need to. If for any reason you just want to manually go in and add contrast, saturation by hand and adjust your color balance, you can totally do that and come out the other side with a really, really solid look, just like we're seeing here. And then obviously this would serve as a starting point to build more color corrections on top of that look. And just to reiterate, everything that we're talking about here can apply no matter what software that you're using. I know that we're looking at Davinci Resolve here, but if you're working in other editing software, like let's say Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere, you can still have the option to either apply a LUT on the shot level or do it globally to your entire project, sometimes using an adjustment layer or some other setting within the software. So if you want to learn more about that, at the end of this mini course, I have 3 individual lessons dedicated specifically to looking at how you can apply LUTs in not only Davinci Resolve, but also Final Cut Pro and Adobe Premiere Pro. So definitely stay tuned for that. But otherwise, I hope this lesson was helpful for those of you new to working with log footage and looking for a simple workflow to just get your images back into Rec. 709 color space.